Bach was not allowed to experience the fame that he enjoys today. He was not granted triumphant concert tours, let alone wealth, like his contemporary Handel. At the end of his life, he even had to realize that his musical style had gone out of fashion. And yet, Bach seems larger than life to us today. His music, his creative power, his sense of family, and his unpretentious religiousness make us look up to him with admiration. Who was Johann Sebastian Bach, and which people and places influenced him? A biographical approach to the artist of the century from Germany. Erfurt was one of the centers of the Reformation. Martin Luther studied here for 4 years. The Thuringian city can rightly be called the cradle of the Bach family. Over 150 baptisms, weddings and funerals of the Bach family are registered in the Kaufmann's Church. Among others, Johann Sebastian Bach's parents were married here. The Bachs had been musicians for generations. When his father had auditioned for his first job as a town musician at Erfurt, he had to prove at the official examination that he could play on 10 instruments. He then moved into the house to the Black Horse on the Krämerbrücke, the Bridge of the Grocers, as his official residence. This unique building is the largest built bridge in Europe and is still today in the medieval style with half-timbered house built. The time in which his son Johann Sebastian was born was marked by economic hardship. 2 years before Bach was born, Erfurt had experienced the worst plague years in its history. Within 2 years, it cost the lives of more than half of Erfurt's population. Thus, the Bachs left Erfurt for economic reasons and moved to Eisenach. Johann Sebastian was born in this neighboring town of Erfurt in 1685 and was the youngest of 8 children. The family's home on what is now Lutherstraße, the Luther Street, no longer stands. Eisenach is also a historical Luther town. Luther went to school here for 2 years. He also preached in the Church of St. George in his adulthood. About 200 years later, Johann Sebastian Bach was baptized in the same church. Johann Sebastian often sang here and learned to play the organ from a relative who was the organist in this church. Today in Eisenach there is an excellent museum which gives the visitor an understanding of Bach's life. It was created in 1907 on this site in one of the oldest buildings in the city, dating back to 1458, in the probably mistaken belief that it was the house where Bach was born. In 1694, Johann Sebastian met his fate. First, his mother died, and the following year, his father. The 9-year-old was now an orphan and was allowed to move in with his 13-year-old brother Johann Christoph in nearby Ohrdruf. His brother took him in, and with his help, Bach acquired a first mastery of the organ. Plus, he sang in the church choir. His brother was the organist there and had learned his trade from Johann Pachelbel. Thus, Johann Sebastian received a sound education from his brother. The small town of Ohrdruf had an excellent lyceum, which Johann attended. Since his brother's household had grown in the meantime, and he was no longer allowed to attend school for free, he had to leave the caring home after 2 years at the age of 15. Bach wandered with a friend to Lüneburg, 300 kilometers away, and there he could finish his schooling in a monastery and he received further important musical education. In this monastery, Bach got the opportunity to get to know the European musical literature. This was, especially for Bach, an immensely important experience since he himself never got further than northern Germany throughout his life. After 2 years of schooling in Lüneburg, he decided to return home to Arnstadt. There, the 18-year-old became organist of the new Bonifacius Church. He was well paid and composes many of his works for organ here. He begins to build his reputation as an organist, once even being called to Weimar to test an organ. Bach's reputation for not being an easy man becomes apparent in Arnstadt. He is constantly in conflict with the town council, which accuses him of neglecting his duties. In addition, he is demonstrably involved in brawls with musicians and choir singers. Bach only had to serve as an organist in the Bonifatius Church in Arnstadt on 3 days, and thus had plenty of time to compose. He met his second cousin, Maria Barbara, and became engaged to her. Because the Bonifatius Church, today is named after Bach, had been rebuilt after a fire, Bach was able to play on a brand new Wender organ. This organ has since been restored twice and is still in use today. What makes him particularly happy is that he doesn't need to wear a wig when on duty. And so today you can admire a statue of Bach in the town without a wig. However, this portrait should be viewed with caution, as it dates from 1942 and there is no picture from his younger years. Professionally, Bach is dissatisfied. The ability of the singers in the small town does not meet his expectations, and so he decides to apply for the well-paid position as cathedral organist in Mühlhausen. He passes the audition in 1707 and moves to Mühlhausen, 80 kilometers to the north. But before that, in 1705, he went to Lübeck for study purposes. He had been granted leave by his superiors in Arnstadt to speak and hear the famous master Buxtehude. This experience must have been a tremendous incentive for the young Bach. Buxtehude's handwriting can be heard in the following organ works. Buxtehude seemed to be taken with a Thuringian, because he offered him the succession to his position. However, there was one condition attached to it, namely the marriage to his now 30-year-old daughter Anna Margareta. The irony of the story, 2 years earlier, Buxtehude had already offered Handel both position and daughter, and now Bach was not interested in either, since he was already engaged. Mühlhausen meant a career jump for the 20-year-old, with the position as Kapellmeister of the church St. Blasii. The position paid well, and he could even supplement his salary by serving inside churches. It was in this romantic chapel in the countryside that Johann Sebastian Bach got married in 1707. His wife Maria Barbara Bach was subsequently to give birth to 7 children, including the eminent composer Carl Philipp Emanuel. The following year, a catastrophic town fire occurred in Mühlhausen, destroying 300 houses. It was the 4th in 50 years. The city government was forced to raise taxes and the cost of living increased for the Bachs. When Bach traveled to Weimar for the renovation of the organ there, the local prince offered him a position with a high salary. Bach accepted and announced his resignation in Mühlhausen after only 1 year and moved to Weimar. Here Bach found his private happiness, and 6 children were born, including Carl Philipp Emanuel and Christian Friedemann, both of whom became famous musicians in their own right. However, 2 of the children, the twins Marie and Johann, died shortly after birth. The city was ruled by 2 princes, Wilhelm and Johann, who were both music lovers. One prince was strictly Catholic and promoted church music to the best of his ability. And for the first time, Bach had access to a professional orchestra, and he composed 20 cantatas. Johann, the other prince, played music himself and promoted secular concert music, so Bach was able to work both styles of music. The city palace was his most important place of activity in Weimar. Most of the ecclesiastical compositions were composed for performances in the so-called Himmelsburg, the Heaven's Castle. This church unfortunately burned down to the outer walls in the 18th century. The chancel, built on a pedestal, was spectacular. Above the altar was a high canopy that reached pyramid-shaped to the roof, where, illuminated by a skylight, was an organ whose music resounded in the church from above. Much to Bach's chagrin, he was subordinate to the two directors of concert and court music. His position as court organist and concertmaster was very well paid, earning more than his two superiors, but he was an employee of the court and thus a lackey, not a free man, what later should have nasty consequences. When the Kapellmeister died, Bach was passed over, and he subsequently accepted another offer without asking permission from the Weimar princes. When the Weimar prince was informed of this, he wanted to teach the stiff-necked Bach a lesson, and had his lackey summarily thrown in the dungeon. It is assumed that Johann Sebastian Bach served his 1-month prison sentence in this tower. The busy Bach did not want to let the time in prison pass by unused, and he began the composition of his well-tempered clavier here. In 1707, Bach, a man with a criminal record, left Weimar for Köthen. The young Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen had engaged him. The art-minded aristocrat himself played in the orchestra as a violinist, and Bach admitted that he had an idea of music. Bach was able to rise socially in Köthen and held the title of Kapellmeister and chamber music director. The orchestra included a proud 17 professional musicians. Bach's main task was now chamber and orchestral music. The following 6 years in Köthen were very productive, during which he wrote, among other things, his solo violin pieces, the Well-Tempered Clavier, and the Little Book of Notes. Privately, tragedy struck him in 1720. Returning home after a journey of several months, he learned that his wife Maria Barbara had died while he was away. 18 months later, he married Anna Magdalena Wilke, a court singer 16 years his junior, who was to bear 13 children, 7 of whom died in infancy. Like Bach, Anna Barbara was a musician employed by the court, and she was a high-ranking one, because she received the second highest salary after the Kapellmeister Bach. The famous music book is also named after her. From the Köthen years, there exist 2 music books, known as the Notenbüchlein für Anna Magdalena Bach, which Johann Sebastian and Anna Magdalena compiled with compositions by Bach and his children. When the young prince married a few years later, Bach had to realize that the new regent had no interest in music, and the orchestra was disbanded. Bach decided to take up a position in Leipzig as Thomas Kantor. His appointment as Thomas Kantor had been rather bumpy, however. After the death of his predecessor, the position had been offered first to Telemann and then to another musician, both of whom declined. Thus, Bach was the only third choice, as one counselor put it. Since one cannot get the best, one must take the middle one. During this time, he was responsible for services and special church festivities of 4 churches. St. Nicholas Church and St. Thomas Church are still standing today, while 2 others fell victim to the Second World War. Bach's main duties included the weekly performances of cantatas on Sundays and feast days. Bach put a lot of effort into this rite at the beginning and wrote cantatas on a weekly basis. It is said that there were 5 years of cantatas, of which 3 years, that means about 200 pieces, have survived. In 1727, the 42-year-old composed his most comprehensive work to date, the St. Matthew Passion. Bach wrote a total of 5 passions. Only 2 have survived. The great importance of the St. Matthew Passion is shown 10 years later, when the 50-year-old Bach copied it again with his own hand and artfully wrote the Bible quotations in red ink. How the audience received this century work is not known. There were probably 4 performances, and then the work disappeared in a drawer for 100 years, until the young Mendelssohn ushered in the famous Bach Renaissance with this work. In 1730, a conflict arose with the council because Bach felt that the performance conditions had deteriorated. He now presented the council with his ideas of a well-equipped church music, thus handing down to posterity an important documentation of historical performance practice from the hand of the master. Furthermore, he also had secular duties as music director. A Collegium Musicum had formed in the city, which gave concerts in the hall and in the garden of the Zimmermannsche Kaffeehaus. For these concerts, he wrote various works for orchestra, such as the harpsichord concertos, which probably gave his sons opportunities to perform as soloists. The Auerbach Keller, a wine tavern dating back to the 16th century with 4 historic cellars, became world famous through Goethe's Faust. Goethe stayed in Leipzig for 2 years, about 20 years after Bach's death, and often visited this wine cellar. So it can be assumed that Bach, who liked the well-tempered beer, had also stayed in the cellar of Leipzig. The Leipzig period was overshadowed by private tragedies. Between 1726 and 1733, 7 of Bach's children died, in addition to the death of his last sibling, his sister Maria. Today, the old town hall in Leipzig houses what is probably the only portrait of the composer in which he sat for a painter. It is a picture created for official purposes and shows him with his music paper and Kantor's skirt. Interestingly, there is a second version of this painting, which was made as a copy in 2-year intervals by the painter's workshop. Considerable differences are visible between the two paintings. One suspects that the original was once not properly restored. The copy from 1848 had been in the possession of the city of Leipzig for a long time, and a few years ago the original was also bequeathed to it by a collector. There is an amazing story about it. The famous British conductor John Eliot Gardiner told that picture hung in his parents' house for years and that he saw it so daily as a child. A Jewish-German family friend had put it there for safekeeping with the Gardiner friends during the World War. Wonderful coincidence would have it that the same Gardiner in 2015, in his function as president of the Bach Archive, was allowed to receive the picture as a donation. Now, both paintings are back in Leipzig. Some experts claim that Bach was a friend of number mysticism. A small proof, please? The sum of the letters of his name is 14, and the number of the buttons of his skirt on the portrait adds up to, you guess it, 14. Pure coincidence? Meanwhile, there is plenty of literature on this and other number games, and you can make up your own mind. Twice in the 40s, Bach visited his son Carl Philipp Emanuel, who was in royal service of Frederick II, called the Great. During the second time happened a meeting with the Prussian regent that achieved anecdotal fame. When his court musician Carl Philipp introduced his father to the king in the royal music room at Sanssouci Palace, the king was aware that he had a musical authority before him, yet he did not miss the opportunity to put him to the test. He played Bach a theme on the harpsichord and asked him to improvise a fugue. The latter played a masterly 3-part fugue, so that the king was astonished. When he wanted to hear a 6-part fugue, Bach had to pass and wrote one down in Leipzig and sent it to the king. This piece became known as the Musical Sacrifice. Bach's late years still brought some great late works. This include the Art of the Fugue and the Goldberg Variations. Soon after, his health deteriorated. A severe eye complaint and disturbances in the arm of his writing hand hindered him so much that his creative work came to a virtual standstill. He subsequently underwent the famous eye operation performed by the passing ophthalmologist Sir John Taylor in 1750. The result, like that of his professional colleague Handel, was a fiasco. Although his eyesight improved briefly, he suffered a stroke a short time later and died at the age of 65 on July 28, 1750. His body was buried in the cemetery of St. John's Church in Leipzig. The exact location was subsequently forgotten. After the Bach Renaissance of the 19th century, people wanted to exhume his body and rebury it in the neighboring church in honor of his memory. The only information about the exact location of the gravesite was the surviving statement, 6 steps straight ahead from the door on the south side. Whether the exhumed body is really that of Bach is not certain. The Church of St. John was bombed during the Second World War. It was decided to take the bones out from under the rubble to eventually place them in St. Thomas Church in Leipzig.